psychic impressions at any given time, and that these psychic impressions wish to come out, and that they do so through our brain, forcing us subtly to make different changes or to choose different words than we may not than we would have otherwise. Humans in English have a tendency to have about 100,000 words internalized, but in a given year we might only use 15,000 or less, and in any given week, week after week after week, our selection set that we would normally use might be, say, anywhere from 1,500 words to maybe 5,000. And so, and then the outliers is what I was interested. Why did a particular person choose this word at that time when they were, when their normal habit was to use a different form or expression? And so I came across this idea, and then the internet really started developing with HTML coming out of CERN in '93. And I was right there at Microsoft where it fired off, and we started playing around with Mozilla. And then I thought, ooh, this is interesting, and started, I was doing SQL database stuff and large-scale projects for some companies anyway, and so set up my own servers and started mining the net in '97 when I did my first run and aggregated all this information. My intent was, because I'd been struck dumb by a brilliant idea in the early '90s, was to follow up on that idea. The brilliant idea was, stock market does not care. It doesn't give a damn about fundamentals or any of this. It's all driven by emotion. And so I thought, and basically lunacy and fantasy. And so I thought, okay, if I can get a step ahead of that emotion and tap into the trend of the lunacy and fantasy and where it's going this particular day, I could make some money. That was my motivation on it. But I fired it off, and universe had me make an interesting mistake, because my first target, so to speak, was this thing called SUN, Stanford University Network, which was a hot stock in the '90s. And I was just going to see how it worked with that. The data came back and started spewing out all kinds of stuff about Sun, the big scary ball in the sky, and I was hooked. And I never went back to look at stocks after that.
So I wanted to start off with the election. Now, you predicted that Trump, or your algorithm and your information came in that said that Trump was going to win. We know that the election most likely was manipulated in some way, but everything that you looked at said that he was going to win. Here we are after the elections, and we see that around the country, people are protesting right now. They're a little upset. Other people are happy. From your data, are you getting any type of information on the mood of the country or the mood of the government officials? What are you seeing right now?
When I first started doing the runs that brought up this particular period of time, the dominant, everything I do is in set data sets. Each set is linguistic, so I don't get a chart or any of that kind of thing. But I have this critter I called the emotive reduction engine, where I assign values for emotions to words, and so I can get an emotional tone. And I use that emotional tone with this vast list of words that is the lexicon that supports the work. And I can get a dominant emotional tone, if you will. And so right at the moment, we're in a dominant emotional tone that will extend at least until the morning of the 19th of confusion. Now, the confusion is not about the election results, but basically about what it means, and in many cases how it came to be. So we have confusion on one side, where the manipulators of the markets, government, media, etc., just as they did in Brexit, had all of their technologies and their tools aimed at a particular outcome, and they are now confused as to how that outcome did not arise. But their confusion is not what our data sets pick up, because we're looking at a vast amount of aggregated data going towards a more social body or general mood kind of thing. And we're in a point of confusion where those individuals that were emotionally manipulated, desperate to see a particular vision fulfilled, are confused because it didn't occur. So imagine a situation, and it'll sound extremely harsh. Okay, I'll tell this everybody up front. It's going to sound extremely harsh if you were involved in this. But imagine a situation where the deep state, with all of its technology, including technology that is designed for and deliberately focused on mass mind control, was aimed at a particular form of a conclusion. They wanted a particular conclusion, which was business as usual, that was going to lead on a particular path to ultimately what they thought would be a limited nuclear war with Russia in the Middle East and in that area. So that was the plan of those individuals that are moving the deep state along. I'm not saying the civil servants. I'm not saying these individuals desired that plan. I'm saying that they were part of a machine, an organization that was moving in that direction, and those people at the top were pushing us that way. Now, in order for that to occur, we're looking at basically mathematics. And let me divert for a second. In the 50s, there was this marvelous science fiction writer, Isaac Asimov. He wrote a series of books called the Foundation Trilogy. In there, he prophesied, so to speak, the sort of the work I do at the moment in an analog of it. But they came across, and he developed this idea of a mathematics involved in social engineering. And the Chinese went ahead and they have indeed perfected, or are in the process of perfecting that mathematics. And if you read Chinese literature, you discover that their social engineering is very focused. And they know that, for instance, if they're going to achieve a certain outcome in a racially mixed community that they're going to take over, they have to have at least 21% Han or racially Han Chinese in control in that environment. 19% won't do. 23 is too much. It's fine, but it's just too much. You don't need it. And so they're that precise about it. So the mathematics are that precise. The deep state had a particular set of mathematics involved, but in order to achieve this mathematics, you can look at an equation that says one man can change the world given enough time and enough energy, or unique happenstance. Eliminating universe and providence and unique happenstance. For one person to change the world, you've got to have as much energy as it takes that one person to affect the other 7 billion people in the world, or enough of them that they can change. However, you get a certain start of a ratio, and you can start doing things. The United States went into a revolution in the 1700s with 3% committed to that goal. That's all it took, and it was successful. The powers that be, on the other hand, had a very different problem. They had to get a vision accomplished that had only perhaps maybe a small fraction of 1% that was truly dedicated to that vision, which was the continuation of the oligarchy and the hegemony of the dollar and the things the way they were. In order to do that, therefore, they had to convince a large body of people to also share that vision. When these people were convinced, they will necessarily crash now that that vision has not occurred. And they will not understand why they are crashing or what actually has occurred to them, okay? And this is where this information becomes harsh. It is my opinion that the entrainment technology that has been developed in the deep, dark UFO worlds and secrecy of the past 60 years, the theoretic or the labeled Cold War era, etc., which was all about hiding UFO reverse engineering and not about war with Russia. But it's my opinion that technology was used to try and engineer this particular vision to occur. And unfortunately, the people that were susceptible to that technology have just been cut loose from it. So they're very much like people that were on a mental support system that was involved, that was energetic, and all of a sudden all that energy is gone. And it's because the powers that be failed and they just turned off all the equipment. It's all over. And this is why we're seeing this particular reaction, and this reaction will continue at least through the morning of the 19th. The reaction is also going to be global because you'll notice that the effects of this were media-driven, and so we have people that were desperately anti-Trump repeating the same homogenic keywords, their selection of xenophobic, racist, and misogynist. That's all they say, xenophobic, racist, and misogynist, over and over and over again. And that these people, when you question them on them, can't provide you any details of it and get really weirded out by it all. And you see this on the YouTube videos now. But these individuals in Britain, throughout Europe, they were as affected. And a lot of these people were sort of like unintended victims of this entrainment technology. And the snapback, the release, is going to cause problems, this state of confusion. Now, there's also other aspects of the confusion, which is as I pointed out, the powers that be at the top, wondering basically, okay, what the hell happened? And then the next question that's going to occur to them is, how do we react and how do we survive? It's not cover our asses anymore. It's survive. If you notice from the WikiLeaks, Hillary actually said, that in very graphic language that we're all going to hang from nooses if that bastard wins. And so that bastard is one, paraphrasing. And so the next step is going to be nooses, and it's going to be to the point where these individuals realize that the crime spree is finished. It's over. There's been a turning. The problem for them is that as Taoists say, we change at the point of the most extreme, and just coincidentally, here we are at the point of the fourth turning within the population of the United States at a deep level that coincided with this. It wouldn't have mattered who actually emerged. It's a situation of historical energetic impetus, and someone would have emerged to fill the role that Trump occupies now. If not necessarily him. And it's my understanding of how these things work that if Trump had been taken out early on and had shown huge progress and so forth and had been assassinated, then we would have had someone else arrive that would have also taken on this particular role at this time to get us to this particular point. So the fact that the powers that be saw him as their stooge, basically he sort of a rope-a-dope, and that's where we're at now. So we're in a state of confusion that's going to go on. It's going to hit the markets very hard, and then we're going to enter into a very large deflationary event in early 2017 that will roil the country in sort of a temporal echo of what happened when right after Reagan was inaugurated.
In your report, I noticed that you said something about government employees getting fired or committing suicide and bankers being dismissed and fired. Are you seeing that there's going to be a wave of, let's say, cleaning house and people getting scared and jumping ship? Is that what you're talking about?
Correct. That's true. More in the civil service side, more in the government side of that particular statement. So yeah, that's the motivation on that part of it is not cleaning house, but trying to eliminate witnesses. That's really what it's going to come down to.
Is the powers that be, the shadow government, the central bank, the deep state, do they have?
Those are all different, by the way. You're speaking with a linguist, and I don't want to be pedantic, but okay. So the whole mass of them, correct? If you want to talk about that, but if you're we shouldn't use each of those words to try and refer to a single entity.
Let's just talk about the central bankers right now. Do they have any plans for the economy? I mean, is the economy still in terrible shape? I mean, is anything going to improve with Trump? What do you?
Certainly. The latter is true. Okay. Now let's, again, not to be pedantic, but let's separate what the central bankers do from the economy. Because the central bankers at the moment are sucking the life out of the economy with their paper financial system. The two are separate. The economy is all the trades and transactions that we do together. Millions and millions and millions of us doing trillions of those things across the time of a year equals our economy. So the central bankers are not in charge of our economy. They can no more affect my ability to trade or barter my old tire from my trooper to my neighbor than they can cause it to rain here. So the central bankers in their financial system are in a deep world of hurt, and that is really sick, and it's going to continue to be sick. But the economy, on the other hand, at a much more base level, is going to continue the way it's always continued, in spite of the fact that we're nearing the end of the repression of the central bank era, at least within this country.
In your report, you talked about baby boomers getting kicked out of their homes. We're seeing these huge mansions being abandoned. I mean, are we looking at some type of crisis heading our way?
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's the deflationary event. Okay, so and actually I probably shouldn't use the word deflationary because I don't know that that's meaningful to most people, but let's call it about a debt evaporation event. So or a liquidity evaporation event, or as we call it in the data sets, a credit freeze. Because here's what's going to happen. The banks alone currently exist not because they own anything, nor because all of us are paying off our loans and they make a little bit of money on top of that, and so they're the happy, congenial community banker that no longer exists. These individuals, the whole structure makes their money because an entity in Washington, D.C. creates the digits and hands them the digits, and then they go out and they tell us those digits are worth something, and they shove them around in databases and this kind of thing, frenetically creating activity but no result. So our problem at the moment is that the banking system, the glue that holds all of that together, is what's coming unglued. And it will at some point reveal the economy. We'll all stand around and look at each other and say, wow, let's go and do something, because now this repression will have been released. But that's not yet. That's maybe a year or 2 years away. In between now and then, the oppressors, the occupying force that is the central bank that has taken over the United States, bear in mind we've destroyed them. The people have risen up and destroyed central banks twice before in this nation,
right.
And we're about to do it a third time. But before we get there, these guys are going to create vast numbers of these digits and do all kinds of manipulation and try and get us to all get on their side. And it's just not going to work. A lot of the confusion from, as you read from the report, is going to be within the upper ranks trying to figure out what to do and how to sell us into their next scheme. So here's the thing. We are dealing with sociopaths, all right? At the very top are the psychopaths. They're the ones running around that say, okay, you looked at me wrong, have him killed. All right, the sociopaths are the people that do the killing because they're afraid not to. But the sociopaths, being the people that do the implementation, are bound by their sociopathic nature. They require willing victims. Sociopaths are basically cowards. If you call them on it, they freak out. They don't have a defense mechanism inbuilt in their mental structure of the world, and they react badly. And so the sociopaths are reacting badly now because the willing victims are not so willing anymore. The vast majority of us don't buy their scheme anymore and are wondering basically what the hell's going to happen. Now, they are in a position of are going to have to try and sell us scheme after scheme after scheme, and they're in a position where they can't not do that. They can't just stop and say, well, we screwed up, guys. You all are on your own. We're going to go off and, go on a cruise to Acapulco or something while you guys figure it out. They can't do that kind of thing. They must continue because of the nature of what's going to happen. But here's their real problem. Every time they do something new, it makes more and more people fall into the camp of not buying their vision anymore. So it's truly beyond ineffective. It's now into generating their own demise. Some of them may be smart enough to realize this, but I doubt it. As you realize from what the data is saying in the reports, we have a very rough couple of years ahead as the central bank dies, and we have to get rid of it. The analogy I'm using with friends around here in emails and stuff is that the dinosaur is dead. The last of the living blood is just now passing through its little tiny brain, but it's going to take us a long time to shove the thing over.
As we go through this, do you see like foreclosures in homes? Do you see people losing jobs?
Sorry, let me go right to that point.
Oh, okay.
Your last question in the housing. As the central bankers dry up, they pinch off the flow of this free money to everybody, meaning the other banks, and the banks therefore will start instituting, as they did in the 1930s, this provision that's in all the contracts for houses that says, hey, we can call this note due if we need to. And that's really what it is. It's long and involved, but it's still in all the mortgages. And it says, at our need, we can make 100% of this mortgage due right now. They're going to do it en masse. That's how they took vast numbers of properties in the Midwest, vast areas of farming land that were aggregated into huge tracts and sold to corporations were seized with that particular provision in 32 when the bonds went and the bond fiasco then. We are right in the middle of another one of these bond fiascos, and it starts right away in terms of the need of the liquidity for the banks. So expect them to start trying to make as much in the way of the profit or liquidity for their institution by property seizures early next year. In the 30s, it took them about 6 months to have something implemented. They may do it far faster now because they have the modern communications.
Isn't this going to make people like really angry, calling everyone's loans, at the same time? People, I mean, we're going to see riots if they do this.
We saw them in the 30s, and the military was called out to shoot people. This was the time in the 30s when factories were taken over by workers that were dispossessed because of the credit freeze that occurred then, aka a deflationary event, as we hear it in the reports, and it leads to the government having to call out the military because you start getting strong opposition to these immoral acts. And their response in the 1930s was, in the area I live up here, was to shoot people on bridges south of me, about 40 miles, where unionists had decided that was enough. They were going to try and forestall a foreclosure sale. See, they still have to go through the legalistic component of it. The robo-signings were their attempt at the bank level to avoid the local sheriffs and avoid the local problems. If they can just send you a note saying you're foreclosed, we'll be there Tuesday to kick your ass out, and there's no, meeting on the courthouse steps to sell the foreclosed property as a, quote, formality back to the bank, which is usually what happens, then under those circumstances, there isn't the huge giant outcry. So they've done everything they can in the last 15 years to engineer a system where they don't have to encounter that local opposition. I don't know how it is in the East, but out here in the West, they haven't been very successful. And so they will get mass opposition. And that's why I say in the data sets, it's coming out about half of the people are just going to walk away, just acquiesce to this. I don't know if it's a lack of support structure, their age, or what the deal is. But the other half are going to be rather miffed. And there's going to be a lot of bad behavior.
Is the government going to react to these people that are angry? Because I can see in certain cities and certain areas that things will get completely out of control. And what will the government, does your data sets and your information tell you how the government is going to control the situation?
No, we get details, and what you're asking is basically for me to describe an outcome. And so you're talking to somebody that deals in things temporally. So it's like, on what day are we describing this? What day do you want an answer for that? Or are we talking at what point in a month? Because this is the way it is with humans. There's always dynamic activities. So this won't happen all in a single day. It's going to happen to individual banks as they need the liquidity. Their response is basically going to be the same, but it's not going to be so ubiquitous that, say, all of the mortgages are called by Wells Fargo on a particular day all across the nation. It's not going to work that way. But at some point along the way, sometime next year, we can all look back and say, oh, look, most of the nation is now involved in this generalized warfare with illegal foreclosures, as the banks are desperately trying to save themselves because the other components of their supposed safety plan, bail-ins and bailouts, are not working.
Do you see banks closing?
Oh yeah, in vast numbers, and it's going to just be absolutely horrific. When it goes, it's not going to be like the this won't be like what happened in the 1930s. Okay, let's take as our basic model what happened in my area, Olympia, in the 1930s. There were 19 banks when we went into the Depression in 1929, and there was one when we came out. So 18 of those banks and credit unions and savings and loans failed in that period of time from 1929, and let's just call it 1942 to say we were nominally out of the Depression here. All right. During that period of time, they failed. We don't have that situation now. We don't have a situation where we have 18 independent banks that were loosely connected to a centralized banking structure. Now we have an octopus, a giant banking system that feeds off of a central heart and a central brain. So big banks will fail, and they'll take out all the regionals. Now, what our data showed about, I want to say maybe 5 or 6 months back, maybe it was longer than that. I just don't remember because I write these things, and I just can't remember. I'd go crazy. But sometime back, the data sets were talking about how the failure would occur, and that it would start at the mid-tier, at the regionals, that they would go first. That banks that had, several hundred branches were maybe across a couple of states, they would be the ones that would be bled dry first, and the chaos would start with them, ATM closures and all of this sort of thing. They're going to try and maintain the big five as long as they can. As I say, the dinosaur just doesn't know it's dead because the last of the blood's still being pumped up its neck.
So you said a couple of things. Okay, so you said a credit freeze a little while back as we were speaking. And when you say a credit freeze, does that mean that supplies and goods will not get to stores? I mean, will
Correct.
Okay.
That's a side effect of
That's
it,
a side effect. Okay.
We've had the credit freeze in the data for couple of years at least, maybe longer than that. It was in very long-term data. Now we're getting into the details as we move closer to the event. That's basically how our system works. For some reason, well, no, it sort of makes sense in a way. Humans are psychic about, some humans are psychic about events in a long-term way, and we get hints about stuff that might happen 3 and 4 and 5 and 10 years out. The closer we get to it, apparently more and more humans are on the same wavelength, and they start picking it up, and we get greater number of leaks. Therefore, we get a little bit more detail. That's like our short-term data. And as we get real close to it, lots of people can sense it. And so they start triggering their psychic impressions, and those come out, and so we get a little bit more details. So that's sort of the mechanism by which it goes. So we've had credit freeze for a long time, and fundamentally, one of the major side effects that you and I will experience is what we call the just-in-time failure, the just-in-time supply system. You have to think of 1940s, end of the war. Peter Drucker goes to Japan. He creates in Japan because they were just destroyed. He helps MacArthur rebuild the country, and they decide on a model called the just-in-time supply system. And that's where the carriers, the truckers, basically are your warehouses. You just don't build warehouses anymore. You sell off all the property and you devote the money to a different system. That's where we're at now. The Western world adopted this model over the 50s, and it's now going to fail. It depends on ever-increasing cheaper energy, ever-increasing cheaper credit. Neither of those is true anymore. So we won't be able to do that. In fact, it's already started to fail. The top shipper, second shipper globally, Hanjin, number 2 shipper of goods around the planet, is in bankruptcy and in chaos, and its ships are not hauling anymore. Doesn't seem to matter because no one's buying so much anymore here in the U.S. because of our problems with our money being so destroyed. But the credit freeze will take that up to the next level as number 3, 4, 5, and 6 and number 1 shippers fail. And then when they fail, they'll be failing under the impetus of they don't have credit to pay their employees nor to front the fuel costs, etc. So we're going to see real chaos as loads get ships and loads and crews become, abandoned and stuck in various ports, and the system breaks down all around the planet. And so that will be a very major concern, is the just-in-time supply system is going to fail. That's what the government's going to be responding to. They're not going to do much in the way of trying to deal with the foreclosure issues insofar as what we see in our data, because imagine, here's a scenario. Now, I'm not saying that all of the description here will be accurate, but this will give you an idea of what we're sort of looking at. Imagine a situation where Trump's being installed. He's not bringing in cronyism. He's not bringing in a giant mass of crony-connected, deep politicians. Therefore, these guys don't know a damn thing about running a giant government, which is not like running a real business. And so there's going to be a period of adjustment that will probably last 18 months or longer because the deep state is going to be obstructing and fighting these guys every step of the way. And then when they're taking a break from the fight, the deep state's going to be trying to pull the rug out from underneath them, just standing there. It's going to be very vicious at that level. These individuals will not be able to address, that is to say, the people that are being brought into a new government will not be able to address the real problems that are besetting the populace in their fight with the occupying banks. And so at the same time, we're going to have the just-in-time supply system crash because those same banks are the ones that fund this weird credit system that gets the McFries to you and, puts, potatoes on the table and that kind of thing, right?
What you're saying is that the government is not going to really help the people during this period of time.
Let's also stop for a second and be real pedantic, and let's start talking in words other than a single word to identify the ruling structure. So the ruling structure is composed of many, many different layers that are huge. So there's going to be people that are at the top that will certainly be freaking out. about everything that's going on and trying to do everything they can. But I don't really necessarily, and they are what we sort of think of when we use that word government. But government's got a huge connotation. It's everything from the El Presidente all the way down to the FEMA guy that's either going to give you a bottle of water or throw you into a camp. And so what are we actually talking about?
I'm wrapping my brain around all of this and everything that you're saying here. You also mentioned something about ATMs shutting down. Does that mean we're going to have a cash crisis?
Correct, as part of the liquidity freeze, but not because they're going to outlaw cash or any of that. They're desperate to do that because the banksters don't want to admit. Well, let me stop and say humans are really funny. We always bring on ourselves, because of the nature of universe, that challenge that we need to face. And so here the bankers are trying desperately to destroy cash. And if you think you have all of these people out on the internet that are offering ideas as to why this is the case, that they need more control, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if you only have digital things, they can control you down to your nads and, pull you on the short hairs by threatening to do away with your bank account. And none of that is true, or it's all true, but none of it is meaningful. The bankers are trying to destroy cash as their part of the system because they're vulnerable to it. They're hugely vulnerable to it because there's only a little tiny bit of real money these days and a huge amount of derivatives on that real money that actually exists. And so the problems that they have are cash-based, but not the way we think. We're going to have a cash crisis, and it's because there is not going to be enough money, actual currency, circulating through the real economy to support their paper games anymore. They were trying to get us all to shift into their virtual sim world and play with their sim money 100% of the time and get away from the cash that really is the underpinning. If you look at this thing called base money supply, you see how vulnerable we are. We have a population that's hugely inflated. It's twice the size as it was in 1947. We have a debt structure that's perhaps 100 times inflated over what it was in 1947, but we only have 2% more actual circulating money going on in society, and that's where economy actually exists. And what they were hoping to do was to speed up circulation by making it all digital. And they've got us all into a digital world, but they're still dependent on that base money, and it's got them got them by the short hairs. And so we're going to run into a big crunch here, a big credit freeze at the same time that we find we're cash strapped. If you look at what's happening in Egypt, right? Egypt is having a huge currency crisis at the moment. Why? Because there's not enough physical dollars in the country to support their derivative debt structure now that they're getting into the deflationary wave. That same deflationary wave has caused hyperinflation in Venezuela, Argentina, Zimbabwe, Kenya, Hungary, Uzbekistan, and so on. And now it's about ready to hit Europe. It'll hit here probably March or April of next year. We'll start getting into the hints of hyperinflation, although I'm seeing temporal markers of it today.
Let me just back up here for a sec.
Sure.
You're talking about a cash crisis, ATMs closing. So for those people listening, will they be able to get cash out? Do you see that, are there going to be bank runs?
Sure.
So
and they'll be able to get cash out for a short period of time, and then the ATMs will be empty. Nobody will refill them, and people will drive around with trucks and chains and stuff and rip them out of the walls just to scrounge through them and see if there might be a buck or two in them, just like happened in Argentina.
So people are going to be desperate to find cash because it's just going to completely disappear. I mean, what you're saying, it sounds like it's just going to disappear.
Well, yeah,
because they can't get to it.
Correct. And see, here's what's going to happen. Right now, how often do you actually touch anything close to money in your daily life? I mean, you as an individual. Mostly the people that are, say, even in my age group, they're dealing with the plastic cards. And as the system locks up, if your plastic card doesn't work, how are you going to pay for something at Safeway or Starbucks or someplace or buy gas or whatever? For a while, there will still be stuff in the supply system. So we live right now without warehouses. So if we were to look at ourselves as a social body, we don't have big giant fat repositories lying around. We're existing on the fat that's being pumped around in our blood, and it's going to dry up. Our blood's going to get leaner, and so at that point, we don't have those extra reserves. and you're going to run into this situation. It's hit all of the countries as the dollar has died. We're in an empire. The empire is based on the dollar, the way the British Empire was based on the pound sterling. We're replicating history. This happens all the time. Empires die from the periphery. Part of our periphery was Argentina, Venezuela, Greece, Hungary, all these countries that were dollar based on their own currency. So we see it there first. So let us not be surprised when it hits, Florida, New Hampshire, California, et cetera, et cetera.
So you also mentioned inflation, and we're seeing some inflation now. How bad is inflation going to get? I mean, what are people going to see? I mean, from everything that you've been looking at, does that tell you like how bad it's going to get for the people?
I get an emotional indicator. I get a lot of language about it, so I have a gut feeling. But we don't, for instance, get charts. So imagine a situation where we're going to get a psychic leak from the future. It's going to happen to you today. You're going to choose a different word today, put it into your email, not email, but on a forum somewhere today. We'll pick it up and it'll get aggregated in, and it will affect our conclusions. Well, the way that works in that chain, people sometimes, in a sense, you can imagine they're sort of like getting psychic headlines as to what's going to happen in the future. Most numbers in our system we throw away because the internet is basically entirely a numeric system. But linguistic numbers that float through for whatever reason, people typing out the number 30 or 13 or whatever in an appropriate fashion, in an appropriate time to be swept into the data sets, that sort of thing does come through occasionally. So it's not like I get a price for a hamburger 2 years from now. I don't have that sort of thing for inflation. I do occasionally have what we might say would be impressions or whatever of screaming headlines. So imagine we're a year from now, actually in July, August, or September or October, in that time frame, and there's going to be a giant headline that says Dow 125,000. So that gives you an idea. So what is the Dow today? It's at like 18,000 meaningless US dollars. Well, right. A year from now, it'll be 125,000 meaningless US dollars. But at that same time, that'll also be the price of an ounce of gold. Insofar as what our system is saying, it's not saying gold's going to be 125,000. It's saying that there's going to be parity about that time between an ounce of gold and the Dow.
So if the Dow is up that high, inflation is going to be running
massively
rampant.
Huge. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, I mean, from everything that you've been telling us, to me, it sounds like the government is going to have a major problem on their hands.
You mean Trump and the people he brings in, or do you mean the deep state? Because they're going to have different problems.
I mean, let's talk about Trump and the people he brings in, because people are going to be screaming and yelling, and most likely I'm thinking they're going to blame him for what is happening, because
we don't get that in the data. We don't have that component of it. Yeah. Wow. Okay. We get the screaming and yelling. We get the riots. Okay. We get the rage. But, okay, now I've got to be circumspect here, okay? And I'll tell you that up front, that I've got to be restrictive on what I talk about, because there's a lot of crap I don't know about how my own system works, and I have to be careful not to break it. The very first time I ever made a public announcement about anything was about the pending 9/11 attack, and within days my system broke down because of giant circuitous references I had never anticipated. As people started talking about it ahead of the event, and my own system started picking it up its own stuff. So I've got to be very careful about what I get into. However, there's going to be a certain series of events that are forecast in the data that will pick up sometime, say around December 15th, that will run through next year, that will have let's say a counter, they'll be the other side of the teeter-totter emotionally, and will draw our emotional focus that way, as opposed to everybody blaming the new crew for the meltdown.
So on the deep state end,
they've got serious problems, really serious problems. Now, the deep state, we also have to identify government as being split into the people at the top, the political people, whether they're stooges of the powers that be or not. And then we've got the entrenched civil servants. We have the shadow government that basically runs the entrenched civil servants, and the deep state is the entrenched civil servants, including military and including all the subcontractors, okay, that are at that level. But then there's that deeper part of it all, uh, secrecy part of the government that is all 60 years of back engineering UFOs, and they're subcontractors, and they're really good about their secrecy. So we only get vague hints about what their issues are. But the deep state is in a real problem because they're going to face this purge as the emotional teeter-totter gets moving back and forth in the dynamic few months ahead of us. And at the same time, the deep state is also going to be reeling as their individual people, that the cogs in their organization come under the same influences as the rest of us. So at some point, for instance, local government fails because people just say, well, I can't live on this fake money anymore. No one accepts it, or I'm not being paid. My digits don't come here, or once I've got the digits, I can't get them out. So what's the point? I don't enjoy my work so much that I'm going to go and do it for months without getting paid. And we saw the reverse of that in Greece, where people kept going and going and going. And we saw it in South America, going and going and going. As their currencies and their countries were going down the tubes, the civil servants stayed on for months. And it was the same as in the Weimar Republic. But in all of those cases, there were countries on the outside, on the border, that had more or less sound money. And so that sort of propped up the system. And there was an expectation of business or work as usual. That will break down very quickly here. And we won't be going months with employees showing up to register your car at the DMV, even though they haven't been paid.
How bad is this going to get? I mean, do you have a time frame where, it's going to start and it's going to get worse and worse before it gets better? Do you break it down in that fashion?
Yeah. It started in 1999. Actually, it started in 1972 when Nixon took us off the gold standard. So, but yes, we have, I have an emotional progression at a finer level that shows the emotional tone of the period as it goes up and down, and so on. So I've got some idea of some of the spikes we're going to run into and these sorts of things. But, that's a forecast of what the emotional tone will be like, not individual events or something that may be causing it. The system is very much Rube Goldberg in that sense, that we don't have a complete painted picture. There's a palette here with a few things, and there's a brush and these kind of things in it. So we just have to make do with what we've got. It's going to get extremely bad, but it's going to depend on where you're at. Relative to that in the U.S. Some places are not going to do so bad. Hawaii won't do so bad. Guam won't do so bad. A lot of places will be abandoning military bases. We won't have the money to bring them back. That part of it's going to happen really suddenly. And, so it's going to cause real problems. That's been in the data sets, since like 2007 or so. And we're getting into that time when all this will occur. There's this book out written years and years and years ago. I don't know the guys' names or anything, but the book was called The Fourth Turning. And it gives a sort of an idea as to what we're going through in a broad stroke, because what's actually occurring at a social order is that our society is changing. It's changing, and there was an attempt at that moment by the powers that be to cause a change towards their vision that we had discussed earlier, because when something's in motion, it's easier to make it shift than if you've got to lift it up and overcome the inertia and all of that. And so they were taking advantage, they thought, of this particular time of emotional turmoil. They had all the technology that they'd reverse engineered from the space alien ships, all this sort of thing, their entrainment technology. They were all set to go, and it failed on them, and they don't understand why. So their confusion is going to play out in their interaction with each other and with the remnants of the control structure of the deep state. So now bear in mind, all of these people that had been working for the criminal class, that had been doing evil acts, now know they're at risk. They now know they've got to be scrubbed in order for those criminal class to get away. These people don't want to be scrubbed. There's a whole lot of them. So there's going to be a lot of people talking. There's going to be a lot of people that feel their best interest is to be a whistleblower or to, confess their crimes, that the people above them get nabbed and not them. There's going to be vast quantities of confusion. So if we describe government, we're not talking about a cohesive whole in any way, shape, or form. We're going to be talking about a dynamic a massive movement. In my last report, the conclusion was titled that chrysalis begins with dynamic motion. And people think of, a caterpillar cocooning itself and coming out as a butterfly or a moth is really a neat thing. And they just sit there and something happens underneath the cocoon. But what they need to understand is that cocoon has to exist ahead of time. You've got to create that. And if you've ever seen a caterpillar or a worm cocoon itself, this is the most strangest dynamic motion you've ever seen as they try and wrap their bodies with this silk over and over and over again from within inside the silk as they're doing it. So that's what we're going to go through. The data sets are basically showing that the U.S. is going to hit a 10-year to 12-year period very similar to what happened to the Soviet Union, and that we will be transformed in this process as we come out of our own form of revolution against a control structure that has existed far too long. And the population underneath is changing. The cool part about that change is that the nature of the people at the operational level of society will change. It won't be all these bloody lawyers anymore. We're just going to get rid of this whole mindset. We're going to go back to people that do things, engineers and builders and that sort of thing.
Clif, thank you very much for being on the X22 Report Spotlight. I really appreciate it. Once again, how can people get your report?
Halfpasthuman.com. We bring them out